What is application configuration management on Kubernetes? So let's first talk about a definition for application configuration management. So application configuration could be anything besides the code, right? So anything your application would need in order to run. An example would be configuration for a DNS record your application needs, access to a database or some sort of connection string to a database, for example. Maybe a configuration for a caching mechanism your application would need. Also, like the connection to the cluster it would need to run in, right? So there's a lot of configuration when it comes to external resources your application is depending on. And then on top of that, there's also more application configuration, which I would say is closer to the application or to the code itself, like environment variables, right? So your code might be exposing a couple of configuration settings to environment variables. So you could basically define during runtime, like what configuration your application should use. So these could be like variables, this could be configuration files you might inject during runtime, also like access to third-party APIs maybe. So the question is now, how do I configure these kind of things inside Kubernetes, right? So Kubernetes has a couple of really nice objects. So besides your pod, which is defining which version of the code is running by defining the container image, for example. There's also objects for environment variables, and this object is called config map, and in there you basically could have a list of environment variables, and those environment variables are then used by the pods. And then same for secrets, for example. Like it's a very similar object, but in this case it's base64 encoded, and is also consumed by the pod, and then the pod has access to those secrets. When it comes to connectivity of your application or of your service to other parts of your application, like other microservices, for example, you might need a service object, which is defining like which route in this pod is accessing which port in this pod, for example. So you ensure the connectivity to other services running in your cluster with this. And then on top, if you need to expose your application to the outside world, you would also need an ingress object. And this ingress object would contain configuration for your DNS record, where it should be accessible and so on. Nonetheless, application configuration management is much bigger than Kubernetes actually. So there's a couple of things which are clearly outside Kubernetes and outside your cluster, and I would still consider them as application configuration, and you also need to somehow manage them. So let's make a couple of examples here. So we already talked about runtime variables stored in those config maps or secrets, for example, in Kubernetes. But on top of that, like when you're building your container, you might also inject build time variables through your CI pipeline, right? So this way you could build like different kind of containers, maybe for development purposes or testing purposes, and they could be different to the container setup you're running in production. So maybe more security in production, more debugging in development, for example. And then on top of that, like anything infrastructure related your application needs to run, you could also control this through application configuration management, right? So there's the term of infrastructure as code, where you use, for example, like Terraform or Ansible to define and set up like a database instance, or maybe you control your DNS records in Route 53 through a Terraform script, or you set up a cluster, or you define like the setup of your Kubernetes basically through those scripts. So these could be also dependent on your application, right? So there could be like specific things for your applications, and therefore I would regard this also to some extent as application configuration, which would live in these kind of like scripts and setups. Yeah, that's basically it. Application configuration management in the broader scope of Kubernetes.